I work very hard at this, and I hope I communicate this to you also when I teach, that when I read the Bible, it's real to me. The people are real, the emotions are real, the places are real. And that helps it take an anchor in my soul. And I hope to communicate that as we go forward here in Mark chapter 9. So we're going to start in verse 14, which is the record of Jesus coming to the disciples. He's coming down the mountain from the Transfiguration. Matthew and Mark make it sound like he's coming down the mountain from the Transfiguration the same day as the Transfiguration occurred, and then came to the disciples. But Luke lets us know that there's an extra day in there. In the Gospel of Luke, it says, and the next day. So this is the day after the Transfiguration event. And verse 14 says, and when they came to the disciples, and that would be Jesus, and then Peter, James, and John. So Jesus, Peter, James, and John went up Mount Hermon for the Transfiguration. They left the 9 apostles behind. And so that here's the 9 apostles, and you remember some of my teaching, these guys are most likely in their late teens, 17, 18, 19, maybe in the early 20s, but most likely in their late teens. And all of a sudden, Jesus is gone. It's like, oh, and they get surrounded by this crowd of people. And there's a guy there with an epileptic son, and the experts of the law are there. And this is northern Galilee, so these are most likely Pharisees. There were experts in the law from the Sadducees and experts in the law from the Pharisees. Because of where they are in the Galilee, I believe these probably would have been Pharisees. So you can just see these teenagers surrounded by these Pharisees, descending upon them, disputing with them. Verse 14, and when that's Jesus, James, Peter, John, came to the disciples, they saw a large crowd around them and experts in the law disputing with them. And who doesn't like a good verbal fight? So I'm sure this drew a crowd. So you've got the experts in the law. Now, what would they be disputing with Jesus's disciples about? Well, what's the subject? The subject is a boy who says, my son's, has a demon, and it throws him in the fire and in the water, and it's trying to destroy him. And I brought him to your disciples, but they were not strong enough to cast it out. And so that the way Jesus was casting out demons, the Pharisees looked down on that. They thought it was demonic. They said he only casts out demons by the power of Beelzebub. So the disciples wouldn't have been using the right name, the right power formulas. And here come the Pharisees and the experts in the law, and they're disputing about that. And of course, the disciples were probably doing their best to defend themselves. But I'm sure, I put myself in that situation. If I was a teenager, fairly new, remember Jesus' ministry only lasted a little over a year. So these guys had only been with Jesus. This is before the Feast of Tabernacles. So they'd only been with him for maybe 6 months. And all of a sudden they're facing off with these old and experienced and probably demonized, experts in the law who are attacking him. It would have been an embarrassing moment, a painful moment, very, very definitely. And yet they're in the fight. And that's what we've got to be. We got to be in the fight. Verse 15, and immediately when the entire crowd saw Jesus, they were very excited because of all the miracles and stuff he'd done up in the northern Galilee. They ran to him and greeted him, and he asked them, but he's not asking the crowd because they're not disputing. He's asking the experts in the law, what were you disputing with them about? That's a good question. Here's the rabbi, here's the teacher, here's the master of the situation. These are his disciples. These old guys are disputing with Jesus's disciples. He's going to step up to the plate. He's going to defend them. He goes right to them and says, what were you disputing with them about? And you know what they say? It's in the text. Nothing. They said nothing, which is typical, by the way, mini lesson. This is typical of bullies, and cowards. They're more than happy to beat up on somebody they think they can get an advantage with. But when they want to face off with Jesus mano a mano, they're going to shut up. And that's one of the reasons we have to protect people around us. We've got to walk with wisdom, with boldness, with strength, with assurance. We've got the power of Jesus Christ. Greater is he that's in you than he that's in the world. We speak in tongues, we interpret, we prophesy, we do miracles, we lay hands on people. We step up and protect those people who don't know as much as we do. And that's exactly what Jesus Christ did. And it astounds me. Actually, it doesn't astound me that they didn't say a word, because that's just like I say, that's exactly the way bullies and cowards act. Finally, verse 17, one person from the crowd answered him, "Teacher, I brought my son to you." Now, when he was going where he thought Jesus was, he didn't know Jesus wasn't there. So he gets there and there's only the disciples. And he's going to say in the next verse, "I asked your disciples to cast it out." But he says, I brought my son to you who has a spirit that makes him mute. And this kind of gives us a window into the culture, because we tend to think that the people of that time period were ignorant about spirits. They didn't know about the devil and his army versus God and his army. They kind of lumped the spirits into good and evil and really didn't have a good handle on who was the leader of the spirits and that kind of thing. But they were such acute observers of people, because they were around people all the time. They were raised around people. They could tell when somebody acted unnaturally or under the influence of unnatural causes, and they recognized that as a spirit. And so he says, my son has a spirit that makes him mute. And we know that there are spirits that cause physical human disease. And here's a good example of that. Verse 18, and whenever it takes hold of him. So there are times when the spirit probably didn't come and go. It was probably afflicting him and inside him all the time, but there were times when it was active and there was times when it was not. By the way, spirits typically hide behind personality traits. So if you have someone who gets angry, then they may pick up a spirit of anger or a spirit of rage, and then what that spirit will do is it will pop up at unexpected times and augment the natural rage or the natural anger of that person to where they become really fierce and very frightening. And then people walk around on eggshells around them. And it's the spirit who uses the natural anger to hide his presence. And that's kind of what's going on here in some way. So it would manifest itself suddenly, throw him down, he foams at the mouth, grinds his teeth, he becomes rigid. This is, probably an epileptic spirit based on whatever kind of symptoms we can see here. And he says, and I asked your disciples to cast it out. And then I love this statement, but they were not strong enough. And that's actually what the Greek text says, that they weren't strong enough. And if you go back into what people believed, why did the Pharisees say that Jesus can only cast out demons by Beelzebub? Because Beelzebub would be a stronger spirit. So they understood that there were spirits that were weaker and spirits that were stronger. Even witches, if you talk to a witch or read about witchcraft, they know that some spells are stronger, some spells are weaker. If you watch any of the Harry Potter movie type things, you definitely see that kind of thing being manifested. So he said, well, I guess your disciples weren't strong enough against this spirit. Of course, that's not actually what the problem was, but they didn't know that. Verse 19, Jesus answered them and said, "O unbelieving generation, how much longer will I be with you? How much longer must I put up with you? Bring him to me." And, this is it's kind of just thrown in there. And I think it's thrown in there because it reveals Jesus's humanity and his frustration. I don't know about you, but there are times that people just drive me crazy. You get so frustrated at the lack of wisdom, lack of foresight, the things that people do that you're just that get themselves in trouble, and you're just like, golly, we could save ourselves so much heartache and headache if we would walk by the word of God, walk with wisdom. And so this is a flash look at Jesus's humanity. He was frustrated with people. The next time somebody does something really stupid and causes you a problem and you get a little frustrated, just think, okay, I'll calm down. Jesus got frustrated and he calmed down. I can do that too. Verse 20, and they brought the boy to him, which tells you, doesn't say who brought the boy. It was the father's son, but he was obviously, the son was in the crowd somewhere because the father had stepped forward to talk to Jesus. So some people knew that this was the boy, so they kind of grabbed him and escorted him along. And when the spirit saw him, when the spirit saw Jesus, now the spirit knew that Jesus had the ability to cast it out, and he probably figured well that Jesus was just about to cast him out. So what the demon does here is very typical of demons, very typical of the devil, very typical of demonic people. If you know you're going to be out of a situation before you leave, you do all you can to cause damage. As my wife is in real estate, and if somebody is, let's say something happens and they're having to sell their house or something like that, and they don't really want to move, a lot of times they'll do horrible things to the house to ruin it, just to make things horrible. That's how demons work. So they brought the boy, the spirit saw Jesus immediately. It threw the boy into a convulsion. And after he fell on the ground, he began rolling around and foaming at the mouth. And spirits and evil people who are satanic or possessed or demonized, afflicted by a demon, do that. 21, and Jesus asked his father, how long has this been happening to him? And he said, since he was a child. And the Bible does not explain why Jesus would say that. There are a couple different reasons that I can think of. One was posited by R.C.H. Linsky, that Jesus wanted to remind the father of how long he'd been in the presence of these other religious leaders and gotten no help at all. I think that many times when spirits occupy a person, they begin to mess up the internal physical body while they're in there. And so the longer they're in, the more damage they can do over time. And I think that may have had an impact that Jesus is trying to find out about. How long has this spirit been in him? And he says, since he was a child. Verse 22, and the father goes on, and often it's thrown him both into the fire and into water to destroy him. And that's exactly what demons and demonic people do. They come to steal, kill, and destroy. And then he says, but if you're able to do anything, have compassion on us and help us. And if you're able to do anything, he knew Jesus was able to do stuff, because that's why he brought his child to Jesus in the first place, because Jesus had been doing miracles. And so what you see here is the heart of a desperate father who loves his son, so badly wants his son to be healed, so badly wants his son to be healthy, and he's just at the point of desperation. He brought his son. The disciples couldn't kick it out. And he says, if you can do anything, have compassion on us and help us. And Jesus, to a degree, engages this, but lightly. Jesus said to him, what do you mean, if you're able to? All things are possible for the one who believes. Now, you and I know that that's not just, hey, I believe this. I mean, I believe that the moon's made of green cheese, but it isn't. You can't, there's a context to this, and the context is revelation. When God gives you revelation to do something, then you believe that revelation and you move forward and you claim it and you do it. And so Jesus here is just saying, look, this is possible. All things are possible for the one who believes. So he's Jesus, it's actually ends up being an encouraging word. Verse 24, immediately the father of the child cried out and said, I believe, help my unbelief. And when Jesus saw that a crowd was quickly gathering around him, and that would be happening, and the more people you have, the more opportunity you have for people to kind of get in the way of things. When Jesus saw a crowd was quickly gathering around him, he subdued the unclean spirit, saying, and that's a specific vocabulary word in the Greek vocabulary. When we're talking about engagement with spirits, he subdued the unclean spirit, saying to him, you mute and deaf spirit, I command you, come out of him and never enter into him again. So there's two things going on here. First, I command you to come out of him. And notice there's no waving of the arms. There's no magic potion. There's no, rattling of rattles or whatever. If you have authority over a spirit, you can take it out with a word. If you don't have authority over a spirit, don't try to take it out. It's that pretty simple. A lot of times you see people yelling and screaming at demons. It's if you've got the authority, believe you've got the authority, speak your piece with authority, and the demon will have to obey. And he says, never enter into him again. And the reason for that is that spirits will come out of a person, and there's usually a period of mental healing that goes on because something happened that the spirit was able to enter in the first place. And so whenever you're kicking a demon out of people, or people have a demon that leaves them, then you want to make sure that demon doesn't come back again. If you go to Matthew chapter 12 real quick. In Matthew chapter 12, verse 3, it's not 3, that's for sure. Let's go down. How about 43? That's a little better. Matthew 12:43. Now, when an unclean spirit has gone out of a person, it passes through waterless places. And the reason it's called waterless places is because spirits like to be inside something that they can affect. They like to be inside a person. They like to be inside an animal. And if they're out, it's like being dry to them. They walk through seeking a resting place, yet does not find it. Then it says, I will go back to my house from which I left. And when it comes, it finds the house empty, having been swept and put in order. Then it goes and brings with itself 7 other spirits more evil than itself, and they enter in and live there. And that last condition is worse than the first. So Jesus Christ is well aware of this. He taught this in Matthew 12 and other places. So here he acts on what he knows. You mute and deaf spirit, I command you, come out of him and never enter into him again. He closes the door so the boy will not become demonized again. Verse 26, and after crying out and throwing him into a violent convulsion, he came out. So the spirit did his last evil that he could do, throw the boy into a convulsion, and then of course he had to leave. And the boy appeared as if he were dead, so that most of them said, he is dead. And one of the things that you learn, and most of you, as I look at the screen, are very experienced in this. You understand this. You walk by revelation. Whatever the crowd is saying, the group of unbelievers, the people that are standing around, you ignore them and you move forward. And that's exactly, they're all, oh, he's dead. And they're all clamoring about it. Oh, my goodness, he must have died. And Jesus just ignores the whole thing. Verse 27. But Jesus, taking him by the hand, lifted him up, and he stood up. And there's two things going on here. One is that Jesus Christ acted first and lifted him up. But if the boy wasn't healed when Jesus Christ let go, what would happen? He'd fall right back down on the ground. So there's two things going on here. One is Jesus acting to get God's energy moving, and he lifts the child up, and then God energizes in the child with healing, because now the demon's gone. Now he energizes healing in the child, and the child stands up. So there's two things going on there. Jesus moving to get God's miracle to where it can take place, and then you have a miracle of healing, and the boy stood up. And then verse 28, And when he came into the house, his disciples asked him privately, and that this is good. I mean, like they'd been disputing with the experts in the law. They'd been embarrassed out there. They couldn't cast out the spirit. So they get Jesus alone a little bit. They asked him privately, why were we not able to cast it out? Verse 29. And he said to them, this kind of spirit cannot come out by anything except prayer. Now, a couple things going on here. First of all, what it tells you is there are different spirits that the way they got in makes them harder to cast out. I know in my personal experience, if somebody picked up a spirit by mistake somehow, then let's say they tried a hallucinogenic drug and they picked up a spirit, that's easier to kick that spirit out than if somebody invites the spirit in because they want something. They want something the spirit can give them. They want revelation from the spirit or whatever. If you invite the spirit in, then it takes more, I don't know, more strength, more whatever you want, more walking by the spirit, by revelation to get it out. So Christ says this kind of spirit won't come out except by prayer. But let me ask you, did Jesus Christ pray? In the record, did anybody pray? No, nobody ever prayed in the record. So what is it talking about? It's talking about Jesus's prayer life. Remember in Mark where he gets up a great while before day and prays? Jesus had a very powerful prayer life, which then opened up doors of communication with the Lord that allowed him to be guided at a level that he knew what to do, knew what to ask. Like this thing about, how long has the Spirit been in him? You realize Jesus Christ kicked a lot of demons out of a lot of people in the 4 Gospels. This is the only place he ever asked, how long have you had it? That was by revelation that he asked that. So he's walking by the Spirit. Well, why is he getting that revelation and the disciples couldn't? And Jesus told them, they said, why couldn't we kick it out? Well, it comes out by prayer. And basically, if you fill in the last half of the verse, it's like, well, it comes out by prayer. And you guys haven't really developed your prayer life too strongly yet. But also we should look at Matthew chapter 17, verse 20, because Matthew chapter 17, verse 20 has a different reason. Same record, but in Matthew chapter 17, if we go to verse 19, the disciples came to Jesus privately and said, why were we not able to cast it out? And he said to them, because of your little trust. In other words, they had been so beaten up by the Pharisees that were around them, the experts in the law and whatever, and they kind of clamped up and they didn't trust in that situation they could do it. So they didn't have a strongly developed prayer life, and in that situation they didn't have trust, and so they didn't get the Spirit kicked out. So that as we go into 2024, I think that's one thing we should pray for is to be more aggressive and more active in helping people get genuine deliverance in their life, to walk by wisdom and get deliverance from any kind of evil spiritual influences they have. Then we read on, and so now they departed from there, and remember they're at Caesarea Philippi, underneath the lip, if you will, of Mount Hermon. They departed from there and passed through Galilee. But he did not want anyone to know where he was, because he was teaching his disciples and saying to them, the Son of Man is going to be handed over to the hands of men, and they will kill him. And after he is killed, 3 days later, he will rise from the dead. Now, this event is before the Feast of Tabernacles. So the Feast of Tabernacles is in September, which tells you that he's got like 6 months to prepare the disciples, his apostles particularly, for his death and resurrection. So he's privately teaching them about that. And I imagine he's teaching his disciples about a whole bunch of things about him being gone. But again, they're in their late teens, perhaps not as likely early 20s, and they're not getting it. They're not understanding it, but they are. What's interesting is here, you guys are well aware that there's situations like if you have a dog, and if you're packing up to go somewhere and everybody's running around, they're all throwing things in suitcases, and there's a level of energy, the dog picks up on the energy. He doesn't know what's going on, but he picks up on the energy, and he's running around and getting into things and all worried and stuff. And that's what's going on here. Jesus is teaching them that he's going to die, be killed, and then rise again. And they pick up on the emotion, but they're afraid to ask. Now, how do I know that he picked up on the emotion? Let's go to the parallel record in Matthew chapter 17 again. It says in verse 22 of Matthew 17, and while they were gathering together in Galilee, Jesus said to them, the Son of Man is about to be handed over into the hands of men, and they will kill him. And the third day he will be raised from the dead. And it doesn't say they understood. Mark says they didn't understand, but they picked up on the emotion, and they were deeply grieved. They could tell as Jesus was relating this to them, that they were picking up on his emotion, his angst, his feeling. I mean, nobody wants, especially Roman, nobody wants to be tortured by the Romans and then crucified. And Jesus knew that was coming. Psalm 22, they pierced my hands and my feet. Zechariah, they plowed my back like a field. I mean, Jesus knew what was coming to him. They didn't, but they picked up on the depth of his emotion as he taught them this, and they were deeply grieved. And I think this is just human. Here we see Jesus's interaction with them, and he could have pressed in because he knew they didn't understand, but he just was an expert at how far do you go. And that's something that is just, it's hard to learn. Sometimes we learn it by experience. Like if somebody makes a mistake around you, sometimes you let it go, you just ignore it, it's not important. Sometimes you just mention it and try to get their attention. Maybe they'll do a little better the next time. And sometimes you got to go quite a bit deeper and see if you can get to the bottom. Why didn't you walk with wisdom? And that's just it's a walk of experience. It's one of the reasons that older people have an advantage over younger people when it comes to this kind of thing. And here Jesus was the master teacher and worked with his disciples just to bring them along in their understanding of what would happen to him. Then we know even by the Last Supper, some 6 months later, they still didn't know what he meant when he said he was going to go away. But they got it, of course, after his resurrection. Verse 33, and they came to Capernaum. And when he was in the house, by the way, the Greek could also be translated at home. Jesus did have a home in Capernaum. If you remember, when he left Nazareth, he took his mother and part of his family, and he moved from Nazareth to Capernaum. And of course, they're going to need a place. So he got a home there. And here he's in the house, he's at home. And he asked them, what were you arguing about on the road? And of course, he knew, but he's asking them to find out, how honest are they going to be? How willing are they to engage in what's really going on? Again, these guys are probably in their late teens. They aren't particularly interested in being reproved or chastised. So he says, what are you arguing about on the road? And again, it's just giving them a chance to step up to the plate. Verse 34, but they remained silent because on the road they had argued with one another about who was the greatest. Now, the reason this is really important is first of all, it's the teenage mind, who's the greatest, but also it tells you that they really understood the prophecies that Jesus Christ was going to be the king and he was going to rule out of Jerusalem. And even from reading the Old Testament, you realize that the king is surrounded by people, and there's somebody who's his right-hand man, and somebody who's the head of his army, and somebody who's the palace administrator. And, to be the greatest is to get to fill these upper positions. So they're, probably, arguing about, who's the right guy to be the second hand in command of running the whole blasted world kingdom and that kind of thing. And they're arguing over that in verse 35, and he knows it. And I bet you he was chuckling, frankly. I mean, because this is just one of those things that is like, okay, they're kids and this is funny, but we got to teach them. And in verse 35, and after sitting down, he called the 12 and said to them, and I like here how they're called the 12. The 12 became a title for the apostles. They were called the 12, and you'll see that throughout the four Gospels. He called the 12 and said to them, if anyone wants to be first, he must be last of all and servant of all. Now, I doubt they got this here. They heard it, but they didn't get it. I mean, at the Last Supper, he's doing the same thing. He puts on a towel, he gets water, he's washing the disciples' feet, he's talking about being a servant, that kind of thing. I think they grew and matured into really understanding this. We certainly see it in the Pauline epistles. Paul really got it. But it's something that you and I, with our age and hindsight, should really get. That if you want to be first, you've got to be last of all and servant of all. If God knows that you have a servant's heart, and God knows that you're serving, and God knows what you're doing in your heart by your service, it doesn't matter if in the eyes of the world you're doing something that's menial or last or servant-like. I don't know. Instead of being the big cheese and having everybody serve you. And he said, if anyone wants to be first, he must be last of all and servant of all. Of course, and then we know if you really get that in your heart and life, then God will promote you. That's what it says in Philippians about Jesus Christ, because he was willing to give up his life. God highly exalted him. And so as we go into 2024, if you're looking for a New Year's resolution, that's a great one. I want to be last of all and servant of all in my heart, not just to gain something later, but to really understand that that's how I'm going to get people to do better in life. And he's going to illustrate this, verse 36, and he took a little child and set him in the midst of them, and taking him in his arms, he said, whoever receives a child like this one in my name receives me. 36 and 37 are two of the verses in the scripture that you can't understand by a reflection in our modern culture, our modern Western culture, because in our modern Western culture, children are loved and coddled and esteemed and treated with all kinds. We talk about spoiling children and that kind of thing. Children in the biblical time of Jesus were important in that they would grow up to be part of the strength of the family. The women would grow up to bear children, which would add strength to the family, size to the family. That was important. And men, of course, would be able to take up arms, plow, defend the family, that kind of thing. But little children were really ancillary. If you remember when the family ate, all the men ate first, and after the men were through, then the women got to eat, and then after the women got to eat, the children got to eat. They were not treated well. The infant mortality rate was tremendous. In some places, it was 30% or more. And so people didn't put a lot of, they didn't put a lot of emotion, as much emotion as we might think, into the children. So when Jesus Christ is saying, look, if you want to be first, I'm telling you what, you got to be last. Let me show you what that means. And he takes a little child. And why would he take a little child? Because in that culture, the little child was last. And that's why he grabbed the little child in that context, and said, you've got to receive a child like this one in my name. And of course, then the disciples are looking at that going, wow, that's pretty impressive. That would have really shaken them up. And whoever receives me does not receive only me, but also the one who sent me, which of course is a great truth. If we honor Christ, we honor God. That comes up in a number of places also, for example, in John chapter 5. And then I like the shift in verse 38, because I think there may have been some intervening time, but there's not any intervening time in the text. And especially if you, and I know most of you guys anyway have talked with teenagers, dealt with teenagers, and they can go just so emotionally deep, and then they kind of need a break. Like today they would grab their phone or something, and so all of a sudden here's John, and John pipes up and he says, "Teacher, we saw one casting out demons in your name and tried to stop him because he was not following us." And you can just see Jesus kind of roll his eyes and go, "Okay, let's deal with this." But he says, but Jesus said, "Do not stop him, because there's no one who will do a miracle in my name and then will soon afterward be able to speak evil of me. If I cast out a demon in the name of Jesus Christ, I can't then go around and say that Jesus Christ is a terrible guy. I just used his name and his authority." So here Jesus is saying, look, just because somebody's not, quote, with us, doesn't mean they're not doing God's work. And that becomes really important. And then he says in verse 40, "For whoever is not against us is for us." Matthew chapter 12:30, he said, that he who is not for me is against me, who is not gathering with me is scattering. So this was a common teaching. And I think it's something that's really important. I have in one of the commentaries, it's God and the devil, and it's the picture of there's a big fence, and there's a guy standing on the fence, and the devil's on one side of the fence, and he's trying to coax the guy down up from the fence to go with the devil, and God's on the other side of the fence, and he's trying to coax the guy down from the fence to go with God. And they do this for a while, and the guy's just up there on the fence and won't make a decision. And finally, God gets up and just leaves and goes back to heaven. And the devil says, "Okay, come down and go with me." And the guy's like, "Well, wait a minute. I'm still up here on the fence. I haven't made up your mind." And the devil says, "You don't get it. I own the fence." That's exactly right. The devil owns the fence. If you're not with Christ, you are against him. He made that very plain. So and that's something else that we can help people with, because there are Christians that they just want to fly below the radar, not really engage in the spiritual fight, that kind of thing, and we can really help them see that that's it's not a wise position to take, because we will be rewarded for what we do, and what happens in this life is just like a test or something for, and a trial and a basis for building on the next. And then he says, "Whoever gives you a cup of water to drink in my name because you are disciples of Christ, truly I say to you, he will absolutely not lose his reward." And so the text goes on and talks about, well, I do want to cover this next point though. So let's go to 42. "Whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me to fall away, it would be better for him if a huge millstone was hung around his neck and he was thrown into the lake," because of just basically speaking of everlasting life. And then in verse 43, he says, "If your hand causes you to fall away, cut it off. It's better for you to enter into life in the age to come maimed, than to two hands and go into Gehenna, into the unquenchable fire." And unquenchable fire simply means it's not going to be quenched. It's not going to be put out until people burn up. And to make it very simple, I've been, I keep working on ways to make life pretty simple for people. I don't know if you guys remember the old game show, Let's Make a Deal. And this is a long time ago, and I'm showing my age. But anyway, there was this game show called Let's Make a Deal, where you made deals for things. And then I forget the guy who ran the show. But anyway, often he would have two doors, and it would be the door on the right or the door on the left. And the contestant had to choose the door on the right or the door on the left. When it comes to human beings, there are only two eternal destinies, period. We can make it real simple. There are two eternal destinies. Every human being that's ever lived will either live forever or die forever. Those are the two choices. Every single human being will either live forever or they will die forever. This is right in John 3:16, that whosoever believeth in him would not perish, but have everlasting life. This is in Romans 6:23. The wages of sin is death, but the gift of God is everlasting life through Jesus Christ our Lord. So those are the two choices. And here Christ is talking about, it's better to live in this life disadvantaged than than try to do whatever it takes, but end up in the lake of fire. And that's what Christ talks about here. And that's something we can really help people with. When people are saying, oh, I don't know if I believe in Jesus, I don't know if I want to be saved, I don't know if, and you can just step in and say, look, let me make this simple for you. There's only two possible destinies. There's door on the right, there's door on the left. One door says everlasting life. The other door says everlasting death. It's your choice. If you choose not to believe in Christ, you're choosing everlasting death. You need to know that, but that's as simple as it is. There's only two doors, everlasting life and everlasting death. And we can help people in 2024 to make a choice for the door that says everlasting life. We can make it simple for people and help them make that decision. So I thought Mark 9 had some really, really great stuff about how to move forward in life, engage in life, some of the things we're likely to encounter in 2024. And so may God bless us all as we move into the new year. And thank you all for being here for this teaching. And